Single dad. Took a job. No one dared, but billionaire CEO's car led him to unexpected joy. Before we begin, comment below and tell us where are you watching from, which city or town. And when it's over, be sure to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. $80, 000 a year, to drive a car that hadn't moved in 3 years. Nobody wanted the job until a broke single father with calloused hands and a little girl who hadn't smiled since her mother died said yes. What he didn't know was the woman behind the iron gates wasn't hiring a driver. She was waiting for someone brave enough to help her feel human again. And in the silence between them, something broken began to heal. The job nobody wanted. Nobody wanted the job. $80, 000 a year, to drive a car that hadn't moved in 3 years. It sat like a shrine in a garage where the air hadn't shifted since grief first made itself at home. Ethan Reed didn't care. He had $17 in his bank account, a 10-year-old daughter who hadn't smiled in months, and fingers still shaped by the gentleness of mending broken wings back when he was a vet, back when life had color. Now, he just needed someone to say yes. The rain followed him through the iron gates of the Whitmore estate, like it didn't trust him to be alone. He stepped onto marble floors with wet boots and a resume he'd printed 3 weeks too late. The butler didn't speak right away, just looked at him, the way men look at broken clocks, unsure whether to fix them or throw them away. "She's been waiting," he said finally, though his voice sounded more like a warning than a welcome. "But I wonder if you understand what waiting really costs." Ethan didn't ask. He already knew. Margaret Whitmore did not greet him, not in the way people greet people. She arrived each morning through a side entrance, black coat, black glasses, and a silence so thick it turned the Bentley into a confessional. She never sat near him, never said his name, just a folded note placed with care on the driver's seat. A schedule, no instructions, no greetings. But Ethan noticed things. The way she paused before getting in, like stepping into that car, cost her more than she wanted anyone to know. The way her fingers worried the edge of a leather portfolio, like grief was hiding just beneath the stitching. She didn't go into any of the places they drove to. People came to her. The bank, the law firm, the cemetery, always the cemetery. 3 visits, each one 17 minutes. Each time, she stood so still, it hurt to watch. One Tuesday, Grace's school called parent conference, a note home, a worried teacher. Ethan was late returning to the estate by 15 minutes, and Margaret was waiting. But something was different. Her posture had softened only slightly, but enough for Ethan to feel it. "Family emergency?" she asked, her voice like cracked porcelain through the intercom. He nodded. "My daughter. She hasn't been the same since her mom passed." There was silence, not the cold kind, the kind that listens. Children process grief differently than adults. Margaret said, eyes hidden, voice distant. Sometimes they just need permission to feel it. The next day, Ethan found a bag on his doorstep. Inside, a full set of expensive watercolor paints. No note. But Grace held them like a miracle. "She must be kind," she whispered. "I think she understands what it feels like to miss somebody." That night, for the first time in over a year, Grace painted, and the flowers she imagined bloomed in colors Ethan had never seen. They didn't speak of it, not right away. But from that moment forward, something between them began to breathe. Not loudly, not fast, just enough to remind them both. The job he took to survive might be the one thing keeping her from disappearing. And maybe, just maybe, they were exactly what the other had been waiting for. Chapter 1. The Gates of Whitmore. Nobody said anything. as the iron gates creaked open. Not the butler, not the man holding a wrinkled resume, and certainly not the house, which looked like it had been holding its breath for years. Ethan Reed tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against cracked leather. The truck sputtered as it came to a stop beneath the arched entryway, a few feet shy of a marble staircase that had probably never seen mud. He wiped his hands on his jeans out of habit. Grease and calluses didn't belong in places like this. The butler's voice, when it came, was slow and careful. "She'll come out at 8. Tertzige, you'll receive the route in the glove compartment. She doesn't like small talk." Ethan nodded. Silence was easy. Silence had lived with him for years, ever since Sarah's laughter had disappeared from their tiny kitchen, and Grace had stopped asking if the son could hear her songs. At 8:30 sharp, the door opened. She didn't make a sound. Black coat, black sunglasses, black gloves, her silver hair pulled into something so precise it looked painful. She moved like someone who didn't want to disturb the air. Ethan watched her from the corner of his eye as she slid into the back seat and closed the door herself. Her voice crackled through the intercom, barely above a whisper. First National Bank. The town rolled by, all soft pastels and clapboard porches and leaves turning gold too early. Margaret Whitmore didn't look out the window. Her hands rested atop a leather folder that she never set down, even to adjust her posture. At the bank, she didn't leave the car. A man in a perfect suit delivered a packet through the window. She nodded once and tucked it into her folder without speaking. That was the routine. The next day, and the day after that, he drove, she instructed. They didn't talk until Thursday. "Do you have children?" The question came without warning. Ethan's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but all he saw was his own surprise staring back. "Yes, a daughter, Grace. She's 10. Silence again, but not the same kind. This one breathed differently. "I used to have pancakes with my son every Saturday morning," she said softly. "We never missed a week." The light turned red. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. That night, Grace used the last of the flour to make lumpy pancakes. They didn't have syrup, so she poured honey over the top and smiled when it dripped onto her elbow. "We're celebrating," she said. "You didn't get fired." Ethan laughed for the first time in what felt like a year. Friday morning. The note in the glove box was different. Same handwriting, same neat ink, but this one had a destination that made his stomach tighten. Cemetery, Elm Grove Road. And at the bottom, "You don't have to wait, but if you do, stay in the car." He waited 17 minutes, long enough to watch her walk slowly across the damp grass in heels that weren't made for soft earth, long enough to see the way her shoulders curved in on themselves, like a house caving in under years of sorrow. She stood before a modest gray headstone. No flowers, no fanfare, just memory and grief that didn't need an audience. Ethan said nothing when she returned. She didn't either. But when she sat down, she didn't close the partition. And that, somehow, felt louder than words. Chapter 2. Portraits of the Past. The rain had stopped, but the sky still sagged low over Mystic. Gray, heavy, honest. Ethan pulled into the estate driveway at exactly 8:20. The gravel crunched under the Bentley's tires like it remembered every pass. 2 crows lifted from the hedges as he rolled to a stop. Margaret emerged from the side door, like always, precisely on time, precisely composed. But today, her hands were bare, no gloves. She entered the car without a word, but didn't reach for the intercom. She just sat. Ethan waited 5 seconds. Then the law office, Morrison and Associates. Her voice sounded distant, like it had been walking through memory before reaching her throat. They drove in silence, but it was different this time. Not tense, Not cold, quiet, like a pause between thoughts. At a red light, Ethan glanced into the rearview mirror. She wasn't looking out the window. She was looking in, at the portfolio in her lap, worn at the corners, her fingertips ghosting over it like it might vanish. He didn't ask, but something in her reflection answered anyway. The law office was a box of mirrored glass, wedged between two colonial buildings downtown. A courier was already waiting by the curb with a manila envelope. She didn't roll down the window. Ethan did. The exchange took 2 seconds, but she didn't touch the envelope, just held it, pressed it flat against her lap, like it carried the weight of something else entirely. On the way back, she spoke again. Do you know what it feels like to be hated by someone you love? Ethan blinked. Yeah, he said softly, eyes still on the road. I think I do. My son. She paused. Michael. He was 20 when he stopped speaking to me. Completely. We lived in the same house, but it felt like he was already gone. Another pause. No tears. Just a woman unraveling thread by thread, carefully, so no one would hear it snap. I used to find little notes he wrote to himself on scraps of napkins. Receipts. One said, people don't change. They just get quieter about who they really are. Ethan didn't speak, but in his mind, he saw Grace curled up in the corner of her bed, whispering apologies to no one. I'm sorry I used the red paint, Daddy. I know it was expensive. I'm sorry I left my socks on the couch. I'm sorry I was loud. Sorry. Like existing was something she had to pay for. They reached the estate, but instead of heading to the main entrance, Margaret spoke again. Go around back. Ethan followed the curved path behind the house, stopping beside a heavy wooden door half covered in ivy. She got out, motioned for him to follow, down a short flight of stone steps, into a side entrance, through a hallway that smelled of dust and clay. She opened a door. The room inside was cool, dim, and still. A pottery studio, long tables, stools tucked in, pottery wheels under tarps. Unfired pieces sat like sleeping memories on the shelves, bowls, vases, things with edges still raw. The air smelled like earth. My son worked here, she said. Ethan looked around. Everything was untouched. Time had passed, but nothing here had moved with it. She walked slowly to one of the shelves, picking up a half-finished bowl. Its shape was imperfect, but promising. The rim curved in slightly, like it had been pinched by hesitation. He died here, she said simply. 3 years ago. Ethan froze. I found him at that wheel, she added, pointing toward the far side of the room. Still sitting upright, hands limp, the clay still spinning. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled now. I locked the door after the funeral. I couldn't bear to come back. She set the bowl down gently, as though it might still remember his touch. Ethan stepped farther into the room, ran his fingers along the nearest table. The dust was thick, but beneath it, the faintest groove of a tool mark. He recognized the work. Care, intent, emotion. I used to sculpt, he said, surprising himself. Before vet school, before Grace. Margaret looked at him, really looked for the first time. You have the hands for it, she said quietly. Later that night, Ethan told Grace about the room. Her eyes lit up. Can I go there sometime? Maybe, he said. It's not really a playroom. I won't play, she whispered. I'll be careful. Promise. Then she added, she sounds lonely. Ethan nodded. She is. The next morning, when he arrived, the tarp had been pulled from one of the wheels. There was a new note in the glove box. Route. Community hospital. Bookstore. Back gate entrance. And beneath it, you may use the studio during breaks. Clean tools are in the right drawer. No name. Just permission? He hadn't touched clay in over a decade. But that afternoon, when he set his hands on the wheel, it hummed like something old had just come home. Chapter 3. The Bag of Paints. Grace was talking again. Not a lot, but more than silence. That Friday morning, she asked Ethan if ducks ever got depressed. He told her, maybe only the ones who lost their ponds. She didn't laugh, but she tilted her head in that curious way that meant she was thinking. That was more than enough. Ethan drove through Mystic with the kind of focus that comes from needing to prove something not to anyone else, but to yourself. That you still belonged somewhere. That you were still capable of small, quiet usefulness. Margaret sat behind him as always, sunglasses on, gloves returned. Silence wrapped tight around her like armor, but there was a crack in it now, a thin one, like sunlight sneaking through an old curtain. Your daughter, she said as they passed the harbor. What's her name? Ethan blinked, then answered. Grace. She nodded once, eyes on the water. And she paints? She used to, Ethan said. Before the accident, it was how she made sense of things. Now she just doesn't. Margaret didn't reply, but he saw her knuckles tighten slightly around the leather folder in her lap. They made 3 stops: the hospital, the attorney's office, and finally, the bookstore. Margaret sat quietly as a young clerk brought a wrapped package to the car. Ethan glanced back. Margaret unwrapped it slowly. A hardcover, pale green, no dust jacket. She stared at the first page for a long time before closing it again. Then softly she spoke. My son used to paint too. Ethan didn't move, not for school or praise, just for himself. He called it breathing with color. A faint smile touched her lips for half a second. It was the only time he looked free. When Ethan got home that night, something was sitting on their front step. A large white paper bag tied with silk ribbon. No tag, no markings, but inside, a full professional set of watercolor paints. Then pristine broches, thick paper, acid-free, every shade Grace had ever talked about, and some she hadn't yet learned to name. Grace froze when she saw them. Her fingers hovered over the tubes, like they might disappear. Are these for me? Ethan nodded. I think so. From behind the window curtain, he scanned the street. No one. But deep down, he knew Grace didn't paint that night. She just stared at the set, cross-legged on the floor, quietly humming something Ethan hadn't heard since before Sarah died. But in the morning, before school, he found her at the kitchen table, brush in hand. She was painting and crying. At the same time, he didn't say a word, just poured her juice and watched the colors bloom across the page like spring showing up in the middle of winter. Back at the estate, the pottery studio had changed. Too, the wheel had been wiped clean. Someone had dusted the shelves. A mug of fresh coffee now sat beside Ethan's usual chair. No note, just waiting. He spent his lunch hour shaping a bowl. Not perfect, not elegant, but his. When Margaret passed the open studio door later that day, she paused, didn't enter, didn't speak, just watched for 13 silent seconds, then walked away. But the next morning, when Ethan returned, another item waited beside his tools, a tin of gold paint. No explanation, no permission required. That night, Grace held up her painting for him to see. It was a little cottage, surrounded by wildflowers, but the sky was a deep blue. And in the garden, 3 people stood together, one tall, one small, one in black. Who's this? Ethan asked, pointing to the woman. Grace shrugged, like it should have been obvious. Mrs. Margaret. She doesn't smile in the picture, but she's still happy. In the painting, Margaret held a bouquet made of impossible colors. On each petal, Grace had painted tiny cracks lined with gold. Like even the flowers knew. Being broken wasn't the end of the story. Chapter 4. The Wheel. The clay felt cold at first. It always did. But Ethan's hands, though stiff from time and grief, remembered what to do. Thumbs pressed in, palms cupped. The wheel spun beneath him, like it had been waiting dust-covered and patient for someone to believe in it again. He spent most of his break alone in the studio now. No music, no noise, just the hum of the wheel and the whisper of wet clay taking shape. He didn't try to make anything special, just bowls. Simple, small, round, useful. There was something comforting in repetition, the kind of comfort that came from control. Out there, life spun wild, but in here, he got to decide the shape of things. Margaret still didn't speak when she passed the open door, but sometimes she lingered, one foot inside the room, one hand gripping the frame, like maybe she was ready. But not today, and Ethan understood. You didn't rush grief, not when it had teeth. One afternoon, she left a second mug of coffee beside his. No words, no glances, just 2 cups, side by side. It was the closest thing to a conversation they'd had all week. The next day, Grace came with him. James looked unsure, but didn't protest. Margaret had approved it herself quietly, with a slight nod and the words, "She may stay in the studio." Grace didn't run or ask questions. She moved through the room like she was in a museum, paused at each piece, touched nothing until she found the corner where unfinished bowls sat stacked beside glazes. "Are these Michael's?" she asked, not looking at Ethan. He nodded. She crouched down and whispered, "He was really good." Later that evening, Margaret stood at the studio door again. Grace had left her painting behind something abstract, swirls of color, a single gold line running through the middle. Margaret picked it up, studying the brushstrokes, then looked at Ethan. "She has her mother's talent. She has her mother's courage," he said. "The talent's hers." A pause. "Then," she said, "I looked happy in her painting," Margaret murmured. "She sees what we don't always admit." That weekend, Ethan stayed late. He didn't have the heart to leave the studio. The bowl he was working on had cracked in the kiln, a small fracture along the side barely visible, but enough to make it unusable. He almost threw it away, then remembered something Sarah used to say, "Anything strong can survive the fire, but what survives the cracks becomes art." He took the gold paint Margaret had left him days ago and filled the crack, deliberately, carefully. The shimmer caught the light. Suddenly, it didn't look broken anymore. It looked honest. The next morning, Margaret sat in the rear seat as usual, but when they passed the bookstore, she tapped the intercom. "Stop, please." Ethan pulled over. She didn't explain, just got out and walked inside. 10 minutes later, she returned, carrying a book on kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. She placed it gently in the front seat. "For the studio," she said. That afternoon, Grace returned with her brushes. She didn't paint on canvas. She painted directly on one of the studio bowls. Purple petals, yellow sky, a single green vine curling like a question mark. Ethan watched from the wheel. Margaret watched from her armchair. Neither of them spoke, but something inside the studio shifted, as if the room itself had exhaled for the first time in years. When they left that evening, the bowl sat on the windowsill, still wet, still fragrant with pigment, and just beneath it, Margaret had left a sticky note in her own handwriting. "Not all cracks need hiding. Some are meant to shine." Chapter 5. The Fire in the Garden. It started with smoke. Not fire, not yet. Just the faint scent of something burning. Something too close to memory. Ethan was trimming the edge of a bowl when Grace coughed softly from her corner of the studio. "Daddy," she said, nose wrinkling, "it smells like campfire." But they hadn't lit the kiln that day. He opened the back door and saw it. Flames licking the edge of the old rose garden near the west wing of the estate. Dry leaves, dead wood, a careless ember from the gardener's burn pile had caught the wind and landed where no one had noticed. It wasn't huge, not yet, but it was close, too close. "Stay inside," he yelled to Grace, already sprinting toward the hose reel by the garage wall. Margaret saw it too. From the library window, she was on the phone with a tenant from Harbor Street, discussing lease extensions. Her assistant's voice buzzed on the line, but her eyes were on the fire and on Ethan running barefoot through the grass, dragging the hose, trying to cut off the flames before they reached the hedges. The gardener arrived with shovels, James with an extinguisher, but it was Ethan who stepped between the blaze and the old willow tree planted decades ago in memory of Margaret's parents. He stamped out the last of the flame with his own jacket, blackened and soaked, steam rising from the cuffs. When it was over, he sat in the grass, chest heaving, palms blistered and red. Margaret came outside without her sunglasses. First time he'd seen her eyes in daylight. They were sea glass green, rimmed in worry. "You could have called someone," she said, voice low. "You were someone?" Ethan replied. She didn't answer, but she knelt beside him, took his wrist gently, and examined the burn. "Let James wrap this. I'll get ice. You don't have to." "I know." She went anyway. Later that evening, they walked the edge of the garden together, not talking, not needing to. The ground was scarred, charred patches in the grass. The roses, some of them blackened at the edges, petals curled inward, like they'd heard the end coming, but the willow still stood, and that meant something. Grace painted a picture the next day, a fire at the edge of a garden, but in the foreground, 3 figures again. This time closer together, one of them holding a garden hose, another carrying a watering can, the third arms wide open. "It's called Almost Burned," she explained. "But not." Margaret studied the painting for a long time, then asked Grace softly, "Do you want to plant something new?" They chose sunflowers, big ones, roots deep enough to survive, faces bright enough to remember. Ethan dug the soil with his bare hands, while Grace laid each seed with care. Margaret watched from a folding chair, sleeves rolled, lips parted, almost smiling. She hadn't been in that part of the garden in over 3 years. "I used to hate sunflowers," she admitted. "Michael said they were too happy to trust." "Mom," Grace giggled. "That sounds like something a sad person says." Margaret didn't correct her. She just kept watching. That night, Ethan stayed late in the studio. The wheel spun beneath his hands again, the clay slick and obedient. He shaped a bowl, without thinking, one that looked suspiciously like the ones Michael had made. Broad lip, curved spine, room for growth. He didn't paint it with gold, not yet. This one, he would leave whole. Closing line hook. The next morning, beside the wheel, a note sat folded in half. "Thank you for saving what I couldn't bear to lose." And next to it, a single sunflower in a glass jar, already turning toward the light. Chapter 6. The Reveal. The first cool winds of October whispered through mystic-like secrets. Leaves blew across the estate's long driveway, golden and brittle. Grace had started wearing her mother's old scarf, too long for her neck, but she liked the way it made her feel, wrapped in something remembered. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the past was about to catch up. Margaret had been distant all week, not cold, just far away, like her thoughts were moving faster than her body could keep up. She still rode in the back of the Bentley, still gave him directions, still lingered near the pottery studio some evenings, but she stopped staying long, stopped watching Grace paint, stopped offering coffee, stopped smiling. In her way, then, on Thursday, everything shifted. Ethan came home to find an elderly woman on his porch, Mrs. Rodriguez, wrinkled, trembling, holding a piece of paper in one hand and a plastic grocery bag in the other. "Mr. Reed," she whispered, eyes wet. "Can you help me read this? My English is not enough." Ethan took the letter and felt his stomach fall through the floor. An eviction notice, stamped with the Whitmore Development logo, Margaret's name at the bottom. Effective in 30 days, her rent would triple. The property was slated for redevelopment. But I've lived here 37 years, she said. Voice breaking. My grandchildren. This is our only home. Ethan nodded slowly and broke inside. There were more. 5 other neighbors had received the same notice. Maple Street, the heart of their working-class neighborhood, was being quietly emptied, all under Margaret's development initiative. Something she hadn't once mentioned. Not in the car, not in the studio, not even after Grace had painted her picture called Almost Burned. Ethan felt betrayed, but worse, he felt used. He arrived at the estate the next day with mud still on his boots, jaw tight, a folded eviction letter in his back pocket. Margaret was already waiting. He opened the car door, but said nothing. Not even when she greeted him, not when she asked about the route, only when they parked back at the estate. The afternoon sun slanting low did he speak. We need to talk. Margaret blinked, startled. She hadn't heard that tone from him before. He didn't give her time to prepare, just held out the notice. This came to my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, 72. Lived on Maple Street nearly 4 decades. You're evicting her. Margaret took the paper slowly. Read it. But her eyes didn't change. I know, she said finally. It's complicated. No, it's cruel, Ethan replied, voice tight. You gave my daughter watercolors and let her believe in flowers again. Then you turned around and gutted our neighborhood like it was a bad investment. Margaret stood still, almost trembling. I didn't want you to know. That part's obvious. He stared at her, hard. You talk about your son like he was a saint. You bring me into your house. You let my daughter paint in his studio. Was any of it real, or just another PR move to help you sleep at night? Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came. Instead, she turned and walked inside. Ethan didn't follow. He just stood there, in the dying light, wondering how many more people she'd hurt while pretending to help. That night, he didn't go to the studio, didn't bring Grace, didn't sleep. He sat on the floor, surrounded by unpaid bills, Grace's quiet breathing in the next room, and questions that had no safe answers. How do you forgive someone who destroyed your trust with the same hands they used to hold you up? The next morning, the front gate stayed closed. No car, no schedule, no Margaret, just a voicemail from James. Mrs. Whitmore won't require transport today or tomorrow. The silence grew. 3 days, then 5, then a week, and Ethan tried to move on, tried to find another job, another rhythm, another life. But something kept breaking, not loudly, just constantly, like a hairline fracture beneath everything that mattered. Then came the hospital call. Grace, bicycle accident. A driver ran a stop sign, a fractured arm. She would be okay, eventually. But when Ethan arrived, hands shaking, heart somewhere in his throat. Someone else was already there. Margaret, not in black, not in heels, wearing jeans, a coat 2 sizes too big, her hair pulled back into something soft and unkempt, and her eyes red-rimmed, tired. Human, she'll be okay, she said, voice shaking. I made sure the best orthopedic surgeon in the state flew in last night. Ethan stared at her. She's not your responsibility. Margaret nodded. I know, but maybe this time. I wanted to show up before the damage was permanent. Then quietly, with no trace of pride, there's something I never told you. And I should have. Her voice dropped. I knew who you were the day you applied. I knew who your wife was. I knew that road. The one she died on. I fought against putting lights there. I thought it would lower property value. Ethan's world tilted. And just like that, the woman who had given his daughter back her colors took the breath out of the room with 5 words. Your wife died because of me. Chapter 7. The test. Hospitals never slept. Even when the lights dimmed, and the halls quieted. Grief hummed under everything like a low, electrical current. Ethan sat in a plastic chair beside Grace's hospital bed, his fingers tangled with hers, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Margaret sat across from him, back straight, hands still, eyes not defensive, just hollow. She'd confessed everything: the lighting proposal, the fight with the city council, her decision to block it because darkness was cheaper than inconvenience, the accident, the obituary, Michael's research, his guilt, his overdose. "I didn't just lose my son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I killed the light inside him first." Ethan said nothing. What was there to say? 3 years ago, he lost Sarah to a tree on a dark road that should have been lit. Now, the woman who could have changed that, who owned the decision like a crown, was sitting here, beside the daughter she almost orphaned, trying to hand him a truth heavy enough to ruin everything. It was too much, too late, too real. When the surgeon came out to deliver the news, successful procedure, no permanent damage, just time and therapy, Ethan felt the air return to his lungs in pieces. Margaret stood and walked to the hallway window, didn't follow him in, didn't ask to see Grace. She just waited. Ethan looked at his daughter, tucked in beneath a blanket with cartoon turtles and a cast decorated with stickers. She opened her eyes, smiled weakly. "Did you bring her?" Grace whispered. Ethan frowned. "Who, Mrs. Margaret? I thought I saw her." He hesitated. "She's outside. I want her to come in." Margaret entered, like someone afraid to disturb the air. She crouched at Grace's bedside, not touching anything, but her eyes were softer now, less armor, more ache. "You came?" Grace murmured. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Grace reached out her uninjured hand and touched Margaret's wrist. "You look like someone who's been crying." Margaret let out a small, helpless laugh. "I suppose I have. Daddy cries too, but he pretends he doesn't." Ethan cleared his throat, pretending to study the IV pump. Grace blinked slowly. "My mom used to say, broken things can be beautiful too, especially if you don't try to hide the cracks." Margaret turned her face away quickly, but Grace wasn't done. "You're not a bad person," she said. "You just forgot how to be a person for a little while." That night, Ethan and Margaret sat in the cafeteria. The coffee was bitter and cheap. The silence between them was rich and fragile. "I didn't hire you out of kindness," she said. "I hired you because I wanted to ease the guilt, and then I got to know you. And your daughter." Ethan stirred his cup. "So this was a test?" "No, it became one." She looked at him then, directly. "I had to know if I was redeemable." He didn't speak, but when he finally looked up, she saw the storm in his eyes had shifted. Still there, but calmer, like the worst of it had passed. The next morning, Grace was discharged. Margaret showed up with a stuffed elephant, wearing a bow and a name tag. Grace squealed. "I'm naming her Charlotte." "Charlotte," Margaret said, smiling. "I like that. She's an artist?" Grace added seriously. "She makes sculptures with her trunk, but only other elephants can see them." Margaret didn't laugh. She just nodded. "I believe that." They drove back in Ethan's old truck, Grace cradling Charlotte in one arm, casted arm in the other. Margaret followed behind in the Bentley, alone as always. But when they got home, she didn't drive off. She parked, got out, and knocked. Ethan opened the door. She held out an envelope. "The leases have been reversed. No one's being evicted. I shut the project down. I started a housing fund to protect families like Mrs. Rodriguez's." Ethan stared at her, then opened the door wider. She didn't step in, but she nodded, slowly, and left. That evening, in the pottery studio, Ethan found her again, not dressed for business. No folder, no notes, just a woman sitting beside a broken bowl. In her hand, A tube of gold paint. I want to fix it, she said softly. Not hide it. No, show it. Ethan sat beside her. Together, they began filling each crack, each jagged edge, not to erase the damage, but to honor it. Margaret held the bowl up to the light. The golden veins shimmered like lightning. He told me once, she whispered, that the most beautiful things are the ones that survived being shattered. And in that quiet basement, with their daughter sleeping upstairs, and the night folding gently around them, Ethan finally believed she might be right. Chapter 8. The home they didn't know they'd built. It started the way most new seasons do, not with trumpets, but with softness, warm bread on a Sunday table, brushes rinsed in glass jars, a child's giggle echoing off studio walls that used to hold only silence. Grace was healing, her arm slowly regaining movement, her laughter coming more easily now. Her paintings had changed to less shadows, more light. She painted people now, not just flowers. One morning, she painted 3 chairs in a garden, one small, one tall, and one with a book resting gently in the seat. I think that one's for Mrs. Margaret, she said. Sometimes people forget they're allowed to sit down. Ethan didn't argue. Margaret had begun showing up with soup, homemade, in Tupperware, claimed it was leftover, but it always arrived still warm. She stayed for dinner now, at first, awkwardly, politely. Then one night, she asked Grace to pass the salt, and it didn't feel like a guest speaking. It felt like a grandmother. No one said it, but they all felt it. The studio had become the heart of it all. Grace painted in one corner. Ethan sculpted in the other. Margaret, she sat in the armchair by the window, reading quietly, pausing sometimes to comment, offer advice, or just watch. Sometimes she brought books, sometimes wine. Once, a dusty record player that she said used to keep the house company. Ethan cleaned the stylus. They played old jazz. The house exhaled. One Saturday, Ethan walked in to find Margaret humming, not loudly, not even on purpose, just a tune, a memory. He didn't interrupt, just started the wheel. Let the sound fill the space between them, like light slipping under a locked door. That evening, Grace asked the question out loud. Are we a family now? Neither adult answered right away. Ethan looked to Margaret. Margaret looked at the bowl on the shelf, Michael's bowl, the one they'd repaired with gold. I think, she said gently, we've been one for a while. The next morning, Ethan made coffee before Margaret arrived. He poured hers first, black, 1 sugar. The mug had a sunflower on it. Grace had picked it out. When Margaret entered, she took it without hesitation, sipped, smiled, and didn't say thank you, because she didn't need to. Later that week, Grace came home from school with an assignment. Draw your home. She frowned at the paper. Which one? She asked. Ethan tilted his head. What do you mean? I mean, is it the house we live in, or the place that feels like home? He thought for a moment, then said, draw the place with the most light. She drew the studio, the windows wide open, the golden bowl on a table, 3 figures inside, one at the wheel, one painting, and one reading with her feet tucked beneath her. Ethan looked at it and felt something ache in his chest. Not pain, something softer, like healing. That weekend, they invited Mrs. Rodriguez over for dinner. She brought tamales. Grace painted her portrait. Margaret cleared the dishes. They sat on the back patio as the sun fell over the harbor, and Ethan realized something. No one was trying anymore. No one was pretending. This wasn't a performance. This was life. Messy, shared, real. When Margaret stood to leave, Grace ran after her and tugged on her coat. You forgot something, she said. What's that, sweetheart? Grace pulled something from her backpack, a small painting of a house not big or grand, but warm and open. I made this for you, she said, because you live here now too, even if you don't sleep here. Margaret took the painting in both hands, and for the first time in years, she cried, not from guilt, not from grief, but because for the first time, she didn't feel alone. Chapter 9. The last letter. It arrived in early November, tucked inside a plain white envelope, slipped between the pages of a book Margaret hadn't opened in years. She found it by accident, if you believe in those. The book was one of Michael's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. His handwriting marked the margins in blue ink. His thoughts, scribbled like breadcrumbs he'd left behind for her to find when she was ready. She wasn't ready. But there it was, folded once, neatly. A letter. She didn't open it right away. She carried it, first in her pocket, then in her purse, then under her pillow. 3 days passed, then 5. Finally, on a quiet Wednesday morning, Ethan and Grace still asleep upstairs, she walked into the studio, sat in the armchair by the window, and unfolded it. Mom, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get to tell you these things in person. I'm sorry I didn't try harder, but I need you to know. Her hands trembled, but she kept reading. I was angry, but not forever. I didn't hate you. I hated what you forgot. That people matter more than buildings. That hearts aren't investments. But I saw you. I saw how hard you worked. I saw the parts you didn't show anyone. The parts that ached. I hope you remember me, not just for how I left, but for how I loved you. Because I did. I do love Michael. Margaret didn't cry. Not at first. She just folded the letter back into her lap like it was sacred and breathed long, deep, honest. Then she looked up and saw Grace standing in the doorway, barefoot, sleepy, curious. Are you okay? She asked softly. Margaret nodded. No, but I will be. Grace crossed the room, crawled into her lap without asking, and laid her head on Margaret's chest. They sat that way for a long time. 2 broken hearts, beating in rhythm. One young, one older, both healing. When Ethan entered, he didn't speak, just knelt beside them, placed his hand on Margaret's shoulder. And in that moment, he didn't see the woman who caused his wife's accident. He saw someone who had lost just as much and stayed and changed and given his daughter color again. That evening, they framed the letter, not as a decoration, but as a reminder of grace, of forgiveness, of the kind of love that doesn't erase pain, but threads gold through the cracks. They hung it in the studio, next to Michael's repaired bowl, side by side. Broken. Beautiful. Still here. The next Saturday, Margaret surprised them. She asked if she could host a community dinner at the estate. Ethan looked at her, brows raised. Are you sure? Michael would have wanted people in this house, she said. He always said laughter belonged in big rooms. That night, the studio glowed. Candles flickered. Laughter echoed. Neighbors filled the air with stories, music, warmth. Grace wore a dress her mother once bought for a birthday that never happened. She painted everyone's name on handmade place cards. Ethan grilled in the back courtyard with James, who had removed his tie for the first time in a decade. And Margaret, she floated between conversations like someone remembering what it meant to belong. Later, she stood in front of the studio fireplace, holding a glass of cider. I used to believe legacy was made of property and progress, she said gently, but now I know. It's made of moments like this, of people who choose to stay. Even after things fall apart, no one clapped, but everyone felt it, like a chord that finally resolved. Before bed, Grace slipped one last note under Margaret's door, a single sentence written in colored pencil. You can miss someone and still be whole. Margaret held the note against her heart and knew she already was. Chapter 10. The light left on. Winter came slowly to Mystic that year, not with blizzards, but with fog, a soft gray that curled around the estate, like breath on glass, inside the Whitmore house. However, it was anything but cold. The front gate once closed, like a jaw now stayed open during daylight hours. The pottery studio welcomed new students every weekend. Grace's paintings lined the hallway walls, and laughter had returned to the rooms that once only echoed with silence. Margaret no longer sat in the back of the Bentley. She rode up front now, coffee in one hand, sunglasses gone. Sometimes she even drove. Ethan had officially accepted the role of estate manager, part operations, part community liaison, part unofficial art teacher. He still worked the wheel, still shaped bowls with the same quiet care. Only now, he didn't do it to forget. Now, he did it to remember what came after pain. One evening, Margaret knocked on Ethan's door. He opened it to find her holding a small wooden box. Inside was a key to the side cottage, she said, the one near the garden. If you and Grace want it. Ethan stared at her. You don't have to do this. I know, she said, smiling, but maybe I want to. He looked at the key, then at her, and nodded. They moved in the following week. Grace hung fairy lights over her window and named the cottage Sunflower House. She painted a welcome mat. Margaret brought cinnamon rolls that tasted like she was trying to get something right after a lifetime of getting it wrong. They sat at the kitchen table that night, just the three of them. A family, unspoken, unrushed, unbreakable. Spring came early, and with it, blooms. Sunflowers rose like prayers from the scorched patch in the garden. One morning, Grace ran in holding a pot of freshly spun clay. It's for Michael, she said. I made it with a crack on purpose. I want to paint it gold. Margaret took it in both hands and kissed her forehead. I think he'd love that. That weekend, Margaret made a choice. She stepped out of the boardroom for good, transferred power, kept the foundation, kept the house, but gave away the rest. I don't want to build anymore, she told Ethan. I want to plant. So they did community gardens, workshops, art programs for kids with grief too big for words. She named one after Sarah. And then, one night, Ethan found Margaret standing in the garden, long after everyone else had gone to sleep. The porch light glowed behind her. In her hand, the repaired bowl. She held it up to the moonlight, letting the gold seams catch the night air. I used to believe grief was something you carried like a stone, she said. But maybe it's more like this. She turned the bowl slowly. Something broken that gets turned into light if you're brave enough to fill the cracks. Ethan moved beside her. I think you already have. She looked at him, really looked, and whispered, do you think there's still time to love again? Ethan didn't answer right away. He just reached out and gently laced his fingers through hers. And for once, the silence between them didn't need to be filled. The cottage window glows warm in the distance, a porch light left on, just in case someone needs to find their way back. Inside, Grace is asleep. Charlotte the stuffed elephant sits at the foot of her bed, guarding dreams. In the studio, bowls rest on every shelf whole, cracked, golden, and on the wall, above the framed letter, a new sign hangs. The light left on. Below it, a sunflower, painted by 3 hands. The light left on. The cottage was quiet now. Even the wind had softened. In the pottery studio, a single golden bowl sat on a windowsill, catching the last light of the day, its cracks shimmering like veins of memory. Ethan stood alone at the wheel, hands dusted in clay, breathing slow. Margaret was in the garden with Grace, both of them planting early spring bulbs. The girl's laughter drifted toward him like birdsong, warm and untamed. Once upon a time, he'd taken a job no one wanted because he had no choice, because the world had taken everything, because grief made him believe life was done, offering second chances. But somehow, through quiet mornings and long silences, through broken bowls and watercolor skies, he'd found a home. A daughter had found her smile, and a woman once known only for her wealth had found her way back to being someone's mother again. The Whitmore estate wasn't an estate anymore. It was a home, not perfect, not polished, but real, because healing doesn't look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like 3 chairs on a porch, a child's drawing on a fridge, a key in your palm when you least expect it, a light left on for the next person who needs it. Tell us, what are your thoughts on this story? Leave a comment below and rate it from 0 to 10. And don't forget, subscribe and tap the notification bell to follow all our latest stories. Don't miss out. Click here to watch more now.